In the bitter winter of 1887, a pregnant widow's act of mercy would change two lives forever. Ruth Langley had lost everything: her husband to a mine collapse, her homestead to debt collectors, her future to uncertainty. Now 7 months along with child, she clung to survival in a one-room lined shack, high in Colorado's unforgiving mountains. When a blizzard trapped a wounded stranger in her small world, she had every reason to turn him away. Food was scarce, firewood precious, and trust a luxury she couldn't afford. But something in the unconscious man's weathered face stirred her compassion. She pulled him from beneath his fallen horse, dragged him to safety, and nursed him through fever and pain, with nothing but pine pitch and prayer. For 3 days, the storm raged, while two souls found solace in shared stories and quiet companionship. But when will Ruth discover that the grateful drifter she saved is actually the most powerful man in the territory? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind had been howling for 2 days now, driving snow through every crack in the chinked log walls of the line shack Ruth Langley called home. She pressed her back against the rough-hewn door, catching her breath after the struggle to drag an armload of split pine from the lean-to. At 47, heavily pregnant, and alone on the backbone of the Sangre de Cristo range, every simple task had become a battle against exhaustion and the relentless Colorado winter. Her calloused hands moved instinctively to the swell of her belly, feeling the child shift restlessly within. 7 months along, and still the baby seemed too small, too quiet. The fear that had haunted her since Samuel's death 18 months ago whispered its familiar refrain: what if this child, like their first, never drew breath in this harsh world? Ruth shook her head, banishing the dark thoughts as she fed another log to the cast-iron stove. The simple gold band on her finger caught the firelight, a reminder of the man who had promised to build her a proper house before the silver mine claimed his life. Samuel Langley had been a dreamer, full of plans and gentle words, but he'd left her with little more than love's memory and a deed to this remote line shack he'd won in a poker game. The one-room cabin measured barely 12 feet square, with a sleeping alcove carved into the north wall and shelves Samuel had built with his own hands lining the east side. Her few possessions, the family Bible, a tin of coffee that would last another week if she was careful, and the unfinished wooden cradle Samuel had been carving when the mine took him, told the story of a life pared down to its essentials. Outside, the storm seemed to mock her efforts at survival. The wind found every weakness in the structure, rattling the single window and sending fingers of cold air through gaps in the logs. Ruth pulled Samuel's old wool coat tighter around her shoulders and settled into the chair he'd made from pine branches and deer hide. The Bible lay open on her lap to the book of Ruth, a passage that had sustained her through the darkest days since his death. "Whither thou goest, I will go," she whispered to the empty room, though she wondered sometimes if faith alone could carry her through another mountain winter. The sound came first as a low moan beneath the wind's howl, so faint she might have imagined it. Ruth lifted her head, listening. There it was again, unmistakably human, crying out in pain or distress. She pressed her face to the window, wiping away the frost with her sleeve. Through the swirling snow, she could barely make out a dark shape, perhaps 50 yards down the slope. Her heart hammered as she recognized the outline of a horse, down and thrashing in the snow. Beside it, unmoving, lay the form of a man. Every instinct screamed at her to stay inside, to protect herself and her unborn child. A stranger in these mountains could mean danger, a drifter, an outlaw, someone running from the law. But as she watched, the horse's struggles grew weaker, and the man hadn't moved at all. If he was still alive, he wouldn't be for long in this cold. Ruth's hands trembled as she pulled on Samuel's heavy boots and wrapped his wool scarf around her neck. The wind hit her like a physical blow as she opened the door, driving snow into her face and stealing her breath. Each step through the knee-deep drifts was an effort, her pregnant body fighting for balance against the storm's fury. The horse, a handsome bay gelding, had broken its leg in the fall and lay panting in the snow, its eyes wide with pain and fear. The man pinned beneath its body was unconscious, his face pale as death, but his chest still rising and falling in shallow breaths. He appeared to be in his early 50s, with greying hair and weathered features that spoke of years spent outdoors. His clothes, what she could see of them, were well-Medea thick wool coat, leather boots that had seen better days but were of good quality. "Easy, boy," Ruth murmured to the horse, running her hands along its neck. The animal's breathing was labored, and she could see the bone protruding from its broken leg. There was nothing to be done for the poor creature, but she might still save the man. It took all her strength to work the unconscious stranger free from beneath the horse. He was solidly built, broader through the shoulders than Samuel had been, and his weight made her muscles strain as she dragged him through the snow toward the cabin. Twice she had to stop and rest, her back aching and her breath coming in sharp gasps. The baby kicked frantically, as if sensing her distress. Inside the cabin, Ruth managed to get the man onto the bed in the alcove. His left shoulder was bleeding freely, soaking through his shirt, and his skin felt cold as mountain stone. She stripped away his wet clothes with clinical efficiency, her years as a miner's wife having taught her to deal with injured men without false modesty. The shoulder wound was deep, but clean, probably torn open when the horse fell on him. She heated water on the stove and began cleaning the injury with strips torn from one of Samuel's old shirts. The man stirred and groaned as she worked, his eyes fluttering open briefly to reveal a startling blue, pale as winter sky. "Where?" he began. Then his eyes rolled back and he lost consciousness again. Ruth packed the wound with heated snow and pine pitch, an old remedy her mother had taught her. The stranger's breathing was steady now, though his skin still felt too cold. She covered him with every blanket she owned and built up the fire until the small cabin was almost too warm. As she worked, she noticed details that puzzled her. His hands, though calloused from outdoor work, were well kept, with nails that had been recently trimmed. His boots, while worn, were of fine leather and expert craftsmanship. The silver buckle on his belt was intricately worked, and his spur shid removed them, along with his boots were of better quality than any cowhand could afford. Who was this man, and what had brought him alone into the mountains during the worst storm of the winter? The wind continued its assault on the cabin as Ruth prepared a thin broth from the last of her salt pork and dried beans. She'd have to make her supplies stretch further now, but she couldn't let a man die under her roof. Samuel would have done the same. He'd never turned away anyone in need, even when they had little to spare. The stranger slept fitfully, muttering words she couldn't quite make out. Once he called out, "Michael," in a voice filled with such anguish that Ruth felt tears prick her eyes. Another time he whispered, "Forgive me," over and over, his face contorted with some inner pain that had nothing to do with his physical injuries. As evening settled over the mountains, Ruth sat beside the bed and opened her Bible. The familiar words brought comfort, and she found herself reading aloud, her voice soft in the cabin's warmth. The man's breathing seemed to steady as she read, and some of the tension left his face. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," she read, her voice carrying the cadence of years of Sunday services in the little church in Pueblo. "He maketh me to lie down in green pastures, he leadeth me beside the still waters." The stranger's eyes opened, focusing on her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he tried to sit up, wincing as pain shot through his injured shoulder. "Easy," Ruth said, pressing him gently back against the pillows. "You're hurt pretty bad. Horse fell on you in the storm." "The horse," he began, his voice hoarse. "I'm sorry. Had to put him down. Broken leg, and he was suffering." The man closed his eyes, his jaw tightening. "That was a good horse. Carried me through a lot of country." "What's your name?" Ruth asked gently. He hesitated, his eyes meeting hers with an expression she couldn't read. "James," he said finally. "James Cooper." Ruth noticed the slight pause, the way his eyes shifted when he gave his surname, but she didn't press. Men came to the mountains for all sorts of reasons, and many of them left their real names behind. "I'm Ruth Langley," she said. "This is my place, such as it is." James looked around the small cabin, taking in the rough furnishings and the obvious signs of hardship. His gaze lingered on her swollen belly, then moved to the wedding ring on her finger. "Your husband?" he asked. "Dead these 18 months, Ruth replied simply. "Mine accident." Something flickered in James's eye, sympathy, perhaps, or recognition of shared loss. "I'm sorry. That's a hard thing, losing a partner." "It is," Ruth agreed, "but the Lord provides, and I'm managing." James studied her face in the firelight, noting the determined set of her jaw and the strength in her weathered hands. This was a woman who had faced hardship and survived, who had learned to depend on herself when the world failed her. "You saved my life," he said quietly. "In this storm, I would have died out there." "Any Christian would have done the same," Ruth replied, but her cheeks colored slightly at the gratitude in his voice. "Not many would have risked it, especially in your condition. That took courage." Ruth shifted uncomfortably under his steady gaze. She wasn't used to praise, and something in this stranger's manner suggested he was a man whose good opinion was not easily earned. "Are you hungry?" she asked, changing the subject. "I've got some broth on the stove." James nodded, and Ruth helped him sit up enough to eat. His hands shook with weakness, but he managed to get most of the thin soup down. As she fed him, Ruth found herself studying his face, trying to read the story written in its lines and scars. "What brought you up here in this weather?" she asked. James was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant. "Running from something, I suppose. Or maybe running to something, I'm not sure anymore." "These mountains are a good place for thinking," Ruth said. "Quiet enough to hear yourself if you're willing to listen. And if you don't like what you hear?" Ruth's hand moved to her wedding ring, turning it slowly around her finger. "Then you figure out how to change it, or you learn to live with it. Those are the only choices any of us get." James studied her face, seeing the wisdom earned through loss and struggle. Here was a woman who had faced her own darkness and found a way to carry on, who had learned to find hope in the midst of despair. "You're a remarkable woman, Ruth Langley," he said softly. Ruth felt heat rise in her cheeks and looked away. "I'm just a woman trying to get by, same as anyone else." But James continued to watch her, his pale blue eyes thoughtful. In the firelight, with her dark hair escaping its pins and her face softened by the warm glow, she looked younger than her years. There was a quiet beauty about her, a strength that had nothing to do with physical power and everything to do with the spirit that had carried her through loss and hardship. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the small cabin, two people who had known their share of loneliness found themselves in unexpected company. Ruth settled into her chair with her Bible, reading softly as James drifted back to sleep. The wind howled around the cabin's corners, but for the first time in months, Ruth didn't feel quite so alone. The baby stirred in her womb, and she placed her hand over the movement, wondering what Samuel would think of her bringing a stranger into their home. But she knew her husband's gentle hearth would have done the same, and he would have been proud of her courage. As the night deepened and the fire burned low, Ruth pulled Samuel's old coat around her shoulders and settled in to keep watch over the sleeping man. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight she had done what her faith demanded. She had shown mercy to a stranger, and perhaps saved a life. She didn't yet know that in saving James, she had set in motion events that would change both their lives forever. For now, it was enough to listen to his steady breathing and feel the peace that comes from following one's conscience, even when the cost is high. The storm would pass, as all storms do. But the choice Ruth had made in the swirling snow to risk everything for a stranger's life would echo through the days to come, binding two solitary souls together in ways neither could yet imagine. Ruth woke before dawn to the sound of labored breathing. The storm had intensified during the night, and she could hear tree branches snapping under the weight of ice. But it was the change in James's breathing that had pulled her from sleep-shallow, rapid pants that spoke of fever and pain. She moved quickly to his side, pressing her palm to his forehead. His skin burned with fever, and sweat dampened his hair despite the cabin's chill. The shoulder wound, which had seemed manageable the night before, now showed angry red streaks radiating outward. Infection had set in, and without proper medicine, it could kill him. "James," she whispered, shaking his good shoulder gently. "James, wake up." His eyes opened but struggled to focus. "Sarah?" he mumbled, reaching toward her with his uninjured arm. "Sarah, is that you?" Ruth caught his hand, noting how it trembled. "It's Ruth. You're safe, but you're running a fever. I need to tend your wound." But James wasn't hearing her. His eyes had taken on the glassy look of delirium, and he was seeing something or someone that wasn't there. "I told you I'd come back," he whispered urgently. "I promised I'd build that house by the creek, with the big windows you wanted, looking out toward the mountains." Ruth felt her heart clench at the pain in his voice. Whoever Sarah was, she had been important to him. A wife, perhaps, or a daughter. The fever was pulling memories from some deep well of grief, and she could see the anguish written across his features. She heated water and began cleaning his wound again, working carefully around the inflamed edges. James continued his fevered rambling, fragments of a life she could only guess at. "The railroad's almost finished," he muttered, his voice taking on a different tone, harder, more authoritative. "Tell Patterson we need another 1,000 tons of steel rail by month's end. The Denver line won't wait." Ruth paused in her work. Railroad? That was no small operation. Most cowboys and drifters wouldn't know anything about tonnage of steel rail or dealing with suppliers. She studied his face more carefully, noting the strong jaw and the way he carried himself, even in unconsciousness, like a man accustomed to giving orders. "Michael won't listen," James continued, his voice breaking with anguish. "He thinks I chose the business over him, over all of them. Maybe he's right. Maybe I did." Tears leaked from the corners of his eyes, and Ruth found herself reaching out to smooth the damp hair from his forehead. Whatever burden this man carried, it was eating him alive from the inside. As she worked to bring down his fever with cool cloths, James's ramblings painted fragments of a complex life. He spoke of meetings in Denver, of cattle drives and mining claims, of a ranch house with enough room for grandchildren. But always, beneath the business talk, was the thread of loss and regret. "I should have stayed home more," he whispered during one lucid moment when his eyes briefly focused on Ruth's face. "Should have been there when they needed me." "Who, James?" Ruth asked gently. "Who needed you?" But he had slipped back into delirium, muttering about train schedules and shipping contracts. By midday, the fever had worsened. Ruth found herself praying harder than she had since Samuel's death, her hands moving constantly between cooling cloths and checking his pulse. The baby kicked restlessly, as if sensing her distress, and she paused to rest her hands on her belly. "What am I doing?" she whispered to the unborn child. "I don't even know who this man is, and here I am risking everything for him." But even as she spoke the words, she knew she couldn't do otherwise. Faith wasn't just about believing in God's mercy, it was about showing that mercy to others, even when it cost more than you could afford to give. That afternoon, James's fever broke temporarily, and his eyes cleared enough to see her face. "You're still here," he said, his voice hoarse but rational. "Where else would I be?" Ruth replied, offering him water. He drank gratefully, then studied her face with those penetrating blue eyes. "You don't know me. For all you know, I could be a criminal, a killer. Why are you doing this?" Ruth considered the question, her fingers automatically moving to turn her wedding ring. "My Samuel used to say that we're all just walking each other home. Some of us get lost along the way, but that doesn't mean we stop trying to help." James was quiet for a long moment, absorbing her words. "Your Samuel sounds like he was a good man." "The best," Ruth agreed. "He would have liked you, I think. He always said you could measure a man by how he treated his horse, and even in your fever, you grieved for that gelding." Something shifted in James's expression, surprise, perhaps, that she had noticed such a thing. "That horse carried me through 3 territories, saved my life more than once." "What were you doing up here, James? In the middle of a blizzard?" James closed his eyes, and for a moment Ruth thought he had fallen back into unconsciousness. Then he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Running away, I suppose. From responsibilities, from expectations, from the mess I've made of everything that mattered." "Family?" Ruth guessed. "Sons," James confirmed, pain flickering across his face. "3 of them, all grown now, all disappointed in their old man. Can't say I blame them." Ruth heard the echo of her own losses in his voice, different in detail, but the same in their essential emptiness. "It's not too late," she said quietly. "As long as you're breathing, it's not too late to make things right." James opened his eyes and looked at her with something like wonder. "You really believe that, don't you? Even after everything you've lost?" "Especially because of everything I've lost," Ruth replied. "I know how precious time is, how quickly it can slip away. If you have sons who are still alive, still in this world, then you have something to fight for." Before James could respond, his eyes widened, and he reached toward the nightstand where Ruth had placed his personal effects. "My watch," he said urgently. "Where's my watch?" Ruth retrieved the silver pocket watch from the pile of his belongings. It was an expensive piece, far finer than anything a working cowboy would carry. The case was engraved with intricate scrollwork, and when she opened it, she saw an inscription: "To James, with all my love, Sarah, 1868. James took the watch with trembling fingers, his thumb tracing the inscription. "She gave me this on our wedding day. Said time was the most precious gift we could give each other." "Sarah was your wife?" "Is," James corrected, then caught himself. "Was. She died 5 years ago. Consumption took her, slow and cruel." Ruth's heart ached for him. She understood the particular pain of losing a spouse, the way their absence colored every moment, every decision. "I'm sorry, James. That's a terrible loss. She made me promise to reconcile with the boys before she died." James continued, his voice thick with emotion. "Said family was more important than any business empire, but I was so angry, so stubborn. I thought I had more time." The watch ticked steadily in his palm, marking moments that could never be reclaimed. Ruth watched his face crumble as the weight of his regrets crashed down on him. "I built a railroad empire," he whispered. "Cattle ranches across 3 territories. More money than 10 men could spend in a lifetime. And for what? My sons won't speak to me. Sarah's gone. I'm dying alone in a stranger's cabin, and nobody even knows where I am." Ruth felt tears prick her eyes at the raw pain in his voice. Here was a man who had gained the world, but lost everything that mattered. "You're not dying," she said firmly. "Not on my watch. And you're not alone." James looked up at her, something vulnerable and desperate in his expression. "Why do you care? You don't owe me anything." Ruth was quiet for a moment, listening to the wind howl around the cabin walls. Then she spoke, her voice steady and sure. "Because somebody needs to. Because you're a human being in pain, and that's enough. Because maybe, just maybe, this is why the storm brought you to my door." The fever claimed him again that evening, and Ruth spent the night in the chair beside his bed, reading softly from her Bible and keeping watch. Sometimes he called out for Sarah, sometimes for his sons, Michael, Thomas, and young James. Always his voice carried the same note of desperate longing, the sound of a man who had realized too late what truly mattered. As dawn broke gray and cold, Ruth pressed her hand to her belly and felt the baby move. This child would be born into a world of uncertainty, raised by a mother who had little to offer except love and faith. But perhaps that was enough. Perhaps love and faith were all any child really needed. She looked at the sleeping man in her bed and wondered what forces had brought them together in this remote place. A storm, a fall, a moment of mercy, such small things to hinge a life upon. But as her mother used to say, God worked in mysterious ways, and sometimes the most important changes came disguised as accidents. The watch ticked steadily on the nightstand, marking time that was both precious and limited. Whatever happened next, Ruth knew that this mysterious James Cooper, who spoke of railroads and cattle empire, had already changed something fundamental in her small world. She just didn't yet understand how profound that change would be. The fever broke on the third morning, leaving James weak but lucid. Ruth woke to find him sitting up in bed, studying the small cabin with clear eyes for the first time since his arrival. His gaze lingered on the rough-hewn furniture, the shelves lined with her few possessions, and finally on the unfinished wooden cradle that sat in the corner like a silent promise. "You made that?" he asked, nodding toward the cradle. Ruth followed his gaze, her hand instinctively moving to her belly. "My husband started it," she said quietly, "before the mind took him. It was meant for our first child, but—" She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. James understood without words. He had learned to read loss in people's faces, had seen that particular grief too many times. "I'm sorry," he said simply. Ruth appreciated that he didn't offer empty platitudes or false comfort. There was a directness to this man that she found refreshing, even when discussing painful subjects. "Samuel was going to finish it for this one," she continued, running her fingers along the smooth wood. "He said every child deserved something made with love, something that would last." James pushed himself up straighter, wincing as the movement pulled at his healing shoulder. "May I look at it?" Ruth hesitated, then nodded. The cradle had been her private grief for so long, but something in James's manner made her trust him with it. She helped him stand, steadying him as his legs wobbled with weakness. James moved slowly to the corner and knelt beside the cradle, his weathered hands tracing the careful joints and smooth curves. Samuel had been a skilled craftsman, and even unfinished, the piece showed remarkable attention to detail. "This is beautiful work," James said, genuine admiration in his voice. "Your husband had real talent." "He learned from his father, who was a carpenter back in Illinois," Ruth explained. "Samuel always said working with wood was like praying with your hands." James nodded, understanding. "I knew men like that during the war. Could make something useful and beautiful out of scraps and hope." He examined the cradle more closely, noting where Samuel's work had stopped. "It wouldn't take much to finish this. The basic structure is sound." "I wouldn't know where to begin," Ruth admitted. "Samuel tried to teach me, but I never had the patience for fine work." "It's not about patience," James said, looking up at her. "It's about purpose. A man or woman can learn to do almost anything when they have a strong enough reason." Ruth felt something stir in her chest, a spark of possibility she hadn't felt since Samuel's death. "You think I could finish it?" "I think you could do anything you set your mind to," James replied, and the certainty in his voice made her believe him, if only for a moment. Over the following days, as James grew stronger, they fell into an easy routine. Ruth would help him with exercises to restore movement to his injured shoulder, and he would share stories of his travels, carefully edited to avoid revealing too much about his true circumstances. In return, Ruth spoke of her life with Samuel, the dreams they had shared, and the quiet contentment they had found in their simple existence. James proved to be surprisingly helpful around the small cabin. Despite his injury, he insisted on taking over some of the heavier, task-splitting kindling, moving supplies, checking the stability of the roof. Ruth protested at first, worried about his healing shoulder, but she soon realized that the work was helping him recover both physically and emotionally. "You don't have to earn your keep," she told him one afternoon, as he struggled to repair a loose board in the wall. "You're still recovering." "A man needs to feel useful," James replied, not looking up from his work. "I've been lying around long enough." Ruth watched him work, noting the precise movements despite his obvious discomfort. His hands showed the calluses of physical labor, but there was something else in the way he approached each task, a methodical efficiency that spoke of someone accustomed to solving problems and getting things done. "Where did you learn carpentry?" she asked. James paused in his hammering. "My father taught me, before I left home. He believed every man should know how to work with his hands, regardless of what else life might bring." "Wise man." "Wiser than his son gave him credit for at the time," James admitted. "I was so eager to make my mark in the world, I didn't appreciate what he was trying to teach me." Ruth heard the regret in his voice and recognized it as an echo of her own. "We all think we have more time than we do when we're young. More time to say the things that matter, to be the people we want to be." James set down his hammer and looked at her directly. "You're not old, Ruth. You still have time." "For what?" she asked, genuinely curious what he saw when he looked at her. "For whatever you want. This baby, a new life, maybe even happiness again. You're stronger than you know." Ruth felt heat rise in her cheeks. She wasn't used to such direct encouragement, especially from a man. Samuel had been gentle in his praise, but this stranger's words carried a different weight, the conviction of someone who had seen enough of the world to judge character accurately. "You don't know me well enough to say that," she protested. "I know you dragged a wounded stranger out of a blizzard when you could barely walk yourself," James replied. "I know you've been caring for me for days, sharing your food and medicine when you have little to spare. I know you've been reading to me every evening, even when you're exhausted. That tells me everything I need to know about who you are." Ruth turned away, uncomfortable with his scrutiny. Any decent person would have done the same. "No," James said quietly. "They wouldn't have. Decent people might have given me shelter for a night, but few would have nursed a stranger through fever and infection at risk to themselves and their unborn child. What you've done goes beyond decency, Ruth. It's grace." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Ruth had heard it countless times in church, but the way James spoke it made it sound new, personal. "I just did what felt right," she said finally. "That's exactly what makes it grace," James replied. That evening, as Ruth prepared their simple supper, she found herself stealing glances at James as he worked on the cradle. True to his word, he had begun the careful process of finishing Samuel's work, sanding the rough edges and fitting the final pieces. His movements were sure and practiced, and she could see that this was not his first time working with fine wood. "Where did you really learn to do that?" she asked, bringing him a cup of coffee. James paused, his hands stilling on the wood. For a moment, Ruth thought he might deflect again, but then he sighed and set down his tools. "I built my first house when I was 19, he said. "Nothing fancy, just a cabin for my new bride. Sarah laughed when she saw it, said it looked like a barn with windows, but she loved it because I made it for her." Ruth settled into her chair, sensing that he was finally ready to share something real about his past. "We lived in that little house for 3 years while I built the business," James continued. "Had our first son there, Michael. Sarah would rock him to sleep in a cradle I carved from pine, much like this one. What happened to the house? Still standing, far as I know. It's on the property of a much grander house now, the one I built when the money started coming in. Sarah wanted to tear down the first house, said it was embarrassing to have such a humble beginning so close to our fine new home. But I couldn't do it." Ruth heard the wistfulness in his voice. "She didn't understand?" "She understood well enough," James said with a sad smile. "She knew that little house represented the only time in our marriage when I was completely hers, when work and ambition hadn't yet claimed the larger part of my attention. I think that's why she wanted it gone. It reminded her of what we'd lost." And now, James resumed his work on the cradle, his movements more deliberate now. "Now I wish I'd spent more time in that first house and less time building the empire that cost me everything that mattered." Ruth watched him work in silence, understanding that this man's wealth, whatever its extent had, come at a price higher than she had imagined. Samuel's death had taken her husband from her, but James's losses seemed more complex, built on choices he had made and could never unmake. "It's not too late," she said, echoing words she had spoken before. "Your sons are still alive. The choice to reach out to them is still yours to make." James's hands stilled on the wood. "What if they don't want to hear from me? What if I've waited too long?" "Then you'll know you tried," Ruth replied. "And sometimes that's enough to live with." James looked up at her, his blue eyes searching her face. "You really believe that?" "I have to," Ruth said simply. "The alternative is giving up on the people we love, and I'm not ready to do that. Not yet." The baby chose that moment to kick vigorously, and Ruth gasped, her hand flying to her belly. James was beside her in an instant, his face creased with concern. "Are you all right?" Ruth smiled, placing his hand where she could feel the movement. Feel that? The baby's just letting us know he's listening to our conversation. James's eyes widened as he felt the strong kick against his palm. That's remarkable, he breathed. It's been so long since I felt. He stopped, pulling his hand away as if burned. Since you felt what? Ruth asked gently. Since I felt hope, James admitted, his voice barely audible. Real hope, not just the kind you manufacture to get through another day. Ruth placed her hand over his, guiding it back to her belly. Then feel it now, she said. This baby is going to be born into a world full of possibilities, just like your sons were, just like you were. James kept his hand where she had placed it, his face soft with wonder as the baby moved beneath his palm. In that moment, with the fire crackling and the wind whistling outside, Ruth felt something shift between thema deepening of the connection that had begun with her act of mercy in the snow. Neither spoke of it, but both felt it, the slow, careful opening of two hearts that had known too much loss. In the making of the cradle and the sharing of stories, in the gentle touch of hands and the promise of new life, something precious was being born alongside the child Ruth carried. The storm outside showed no signs of abating, but inside the small cabin, two people who had thought themselves beyond such gifts were discovering that grace could appear in the most unexpected forms. By the fifth day, James was strong enough to venture outside for short periods, and Ruth was grateful for his help with the heavier chores. The storm had dumped nearly 4 feet of snow around the cabin, and without his assistance, she would have struggled to keep pathways clear and ensure adequate firewood. As she watched him work, Ruth couldn't help but notice the quality of his gear. His spurs, which she had cleaned and set aside with his other belongings, bore intricate silver work and bore the initials J.H. engraved in flowing script. The discrepancy with the name he had given her, James Cooper, hadn't escaped her notice, but she respected his privacy. Men in the territories often had reasons for using different names, and she had learned not to pry. "Those are beautiful spurs," she commented one morning as she helped him lace his boots. "Family heirloom?" James glanced at the silver pieces, and she saw a flicker of something caution, perhaps, or calculation cross his features. "Something like that," he said carefully. "A gift from someone who mattered to me." Ruth nodded, accepting the non-answer. She handed him the spurs, watching as he strapped them on with the practiced ease of a man who had worn them for years. The weight and balance seemed perfectly suited to him, and she wondered what kind of work required such fine equipment. "You're not a common cowhand, are you?" she asked directly. James paused in adjusting the leather straps. "What makes you say that?" "Your hands, for one thing. Calloused, yes, but not from holding a branding iron day after day. Your speech, you're educated, probably well educated, and those spurs cost more than most men make in a month." James straightened slowly, his blue eyes meeting hers with something like respect. "You're very observant." "I've had to be. A woman alone learns to read people quickly, or she doesn't survive long." "And what do you read in me?" Ruth considered the question seriously, studying his face in the morning light streaming through the window. "A man running from something, but not the law. Your conscience, maybe, or responsibilities you're not ready to face. You're used to giving orders, being in control. The way you approach problems, the certainty in your voice when you give advice, you're accustomed to people listening when you speak." James was quiet for a long moment. "Anything else?" "You're lonely," Ruth said softly. "Bone, deep lonely. The kind that comes from having people around you but no one who really knows you. And you're afraid not of physical danger, but of disappointing people you care about. Or maybe of them disappointing you." James stared at her, and Ruth saw something vulnerable flicker in his expression before he looked away. "You see a lot for someone who's known me less than a week." "Pain recognizes pain," Ruth replied. "Loss recognizes loss. Whatever brought you to these mountains, James, it wasn't a pleasure ride." She left him to his thoughts and went about her morning routine, but she could feel his eyes following her as she moved around the small cabin. There was an intensity to his attention that both flattered and unsettled her. It had been so long since any man had looked at her as more than Samuel Langley's widow or a burden to be pitied. That afternoon, James surprised her by producing a small sewing kit from his saddlebags. "I noticed your dress is wearing thin at the elbows," he said, offering her the leather pouch. "Thought you might find use for this." Ruth opened the kit to find an array of fine needles, strong thread, and even small scissors of excellent quality. "This is far too nice for me to—" "It belonged to my Sarah," James interrupted. "She would have wanted it to be useful, not gathering dust in a dead man's saddlebags." Ruth looked up at him, understanding the significance of the gift. "Are you sure?" "She always said the best way to honor the dead was to help the living," James replied. "Besides, a child should have a mother who doesn't have to worry about keeping her clothes together." Ruth's throat tightened with emotion. It was such a simple gift, but it spoke to needs she hadn't even voiced. The pride of a woman who wanted to look decent, the practical necessity of maintaining her few possessions. "Thank you," she whispered. As she examined the contents more closely, Ruth noticed initials embroidered on the silk lining of the kit, S.C.H. The middle initial didn't match James's supposed surname of Cooper, but she filed the observation away without comment. That evening, as Ruth mended her dress by firelight, James worked on the cradle with steady concentration. The piece was nearly finished now, and Ruth marveled at the transformation. What had been rough, unfinished wood was becoming something beautiful, smooth, sturdy, and perfectly proportioned. "You've done more than finish it," she observed. "You've improved on Samuel's original design." James looked up from his work. "I hope you don't mind. I added some reinforcement to the joints and carved a few details I thought you might like." Ruth examined his additions more closely. He had carved a simple but elegant pattern of vines and leaves around the headboard, and the rockers were now perfectly balanced. "It's beautiful." Samuel would have been proud to see his work completed so skillfully. "He was a good man, your Samuel. I can see it in everything he made, everything he touched in this place. There's love in the work." Ruth set down her mending and watched James's face in the firelight. "You speak of love like something you've lost." "Haven't we all lost it, one way or another?" James replied, not looking up from his carving. "No," Ruth said firmly. "Lost people, yes, but love itself, that's something we carry with us, even when the people who inspired it are gone. Samuel's love didn't die with him. It lives in this cabin he built, in the way he taught me to be strong, in the child I'm carrying who will know his father through the stories I tell." James's hands stilled on the wood. "You really believe that?" "I have to. Otherwise, what's the point of loving anyone if it all just ends when they die?" James set down his carving tools and looked directly at her. "My Sarah used to say something similar. She believed love was the only thing that lasted, the only thing that mattered in the end. She sounds like a wise woman." She was. Too wise for the fool she married. James's voice carried a weight of regret that made Ruth's heart ache for him. "Tell me about her," Ruth said gently. James was quiet for so long that Ruth thought he might not answer. Then, slowly, he began to speak. "She was the daughter of a bank president in Denver. I was nobody, young man, with big dreams and empty pockets. Her father forbade the match, said I'd never amount to anything. But she married you anyway? Eloped with me to a little church in Colorado Springs. We had $50 between us and a borrowed wagon." James smiled at the memory. "She never regretted it, not even when things got hard in those early years. She believed in you, more than I believed in myself. When I started the first business, a small freight operation, she worked alongside me, keeping books, negotiating contracts. She had a head for numbers and a way with people that I lacked." Ruth heard the love in his voice, but also the pain that came after. What changed? Success changed everything. The freight business led to land speculation, then cattle, then mining investments, then the railroad contracts. With each expansion, Sarah had to step back further from the day-to-day operations. She said I didn't need her anymore, that the business had become my true wife. And had it? James was quiet again, struggling with the truth. Yes, he admitted finally. God help me, yes. I told myself I was building something for her, for our sons. But the truth was, I was building it for myself, for the validation, the respect, the power of it. Ruth understood. She had seen it before in the mining campsmen who started with noble intentions but lost themselves in the pursuit of wealth and status. Did she tell you how she felt? Many times. But I always had a reason why this deal or that expansion was necessary, why I couldn't slow down just yet. I promised her that once I had enough, once the business was secure, I would step back and we could have the life she wanted. But there was never enough. Never. There was always another opportunity, another competitor to outmaneuver, another territory to expand into. By the time I realized what I had lost, Sarah was sick, and my sons had grown into men who barely knew their father. Ruth felt tears prick her eyes at the pain in his voice. Here was a man who had gained everything the world said was important and lost everything that actually was. Is that why you were in the mountains, trying to find a way back to them? James nodded slowly. I thought if I could just get away from all of it, clear my head, maybe I could figure out how to bridge the gap. But the truth is, I don't even know who I am anymore without the business, without the constant activity. For 30 years, I've defined myself by what I built, what I owned, what I controlled. Take that away, and what's left? Ruth set aside her mending and moved to sit beside him on the rough wooden bench Samuel had made. A man who still grieves for his wife, a man who wants to reconcile with his sons, a man who can work with his hands and finish a cradle with love and skill. That's not nothing, James. He looked at her with something like wonder. You have a way of making things sound simpler than they are. Maybe they are simpler than you think. Maybe all the complexity comes from trying to be something you're not, trying to prove something that doesn't need proving. James reached out and touched her hand gently. How did you get so wise? Ruth felt warmth spread through her at his touch. Loss teaches you what matters and what doesn't. Pain burns away everything that isn't essential. What's left is usually simpler and truer than what you started with. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn low. The baby moved restlessly in Ruth's womb, and she placed her hand over the movement. James watched her face, noting the soft smile that always appeared when she felt the child stir. You're going to be a wonderful mother, he said quietly. I hope so. This baby deserves better than what I can give a real home, a father, security. This baby will have something more valuable than any of those things, James replied. A mother who understands that love is the only thing that really matters. Ruth felt tears threaten again, but they were different tears than she had shed in months' tears, of hope rather than grief. In this quiet cabin, with snow falling outside and a gentleman beside her, she could almost believe that her future held more than mere survival. As if sensing her thoughts, James squeezed her hand gently. Whatever happens when this storm ends, Ruth, I want you to know that these days with you have given me something I thought I'd lost forever. What's that? The memory of who I used to be before I became so afraid of not being enough. You've reminded me that a man's worth isn't measured by what he owns, but by how he treats the people who depend on him. Ruth turned her hand in his, their fingers intertwining naturally. And you've reminded me that I'm still a woman, not just a widow, that I still have something to offer besides grief and need. Outside, the wind howled around the cabin's corners, but inside, two people who had thought themselves beyond such gifts were discovering that connection could bloom, even in the harshest seasons. The Silver Spurs sat by the door, their engraved initials catching the firelight, holding secrets that would soon reshape everything they thought they knew about each other. On the 7th morning, Ruth made a discovery that changed everything she thought she knew about her situation. While organizing James's belongings, she's clothes had finally dried completely, she found a folded document that had fallen from his coat pocket. The paper was official, heavy stock with an embossed letterhead, and as she picked it up to return it to his things, her eyes caught the heading, Sangre de Cristo Mining and Railroad Company, Deed Transfer. Her heart stopped. This was her land. They were discussing the small parcel that included the line shack and the surrounding 40 acres. According to the document, the property was being transferred from the previous owner to one James Harrington for the sum of $50, described as payment of debts owed. Ruth sank into her chair, the paper trembling in her hands. James Harrington, not Cooper. And this deed dated just 2 weeks ago showed that the man she had been caring for was now the legal owner of her home. But that was impossible. She had her own deed, the one Samuel had won in that poker game, fair and square. Her deed was legal, properly filed with the territorial government. How could James Harrington claim ownership of the same property? With growing dread, Ruth retrieved her own deed from the wooden box where she kept her important papers. As she compared the two documents, the terrible truth became clear. The previous owner mentioned in James's deed was the same man who had lost the property to Samuel in that poker gamia man named Garrett Walsh. Walsh had apparently sold the land to James Harrington, claiming it was his to sell. But Walsh hadn't owned the property when he made that sale. Samuel had won it from him months earlier. Either Walsh was running a confidence game, selling land he no longer owned, or Ruth's blood ran cold at the thought Samuel's poker winnings hadn't been as legitimate as he'd believed. She heard James moving around outside, chopping wood despite his healing shoulder, and felt a surge of anger and betrayal. Had he known? Had he been planning this all along, some elaborate scheme to claim her property? Was his injury even real, or had it all been an act to gain her sympathy and trust? But even as the accusations formed in her mind, Ruth found herself doubting them. The man who had wept for his dead wife, who had finished Samuel's cradle with such tender care, who had shared his deepest regrets and fears that man couldn't be capable of such elaborate deception. Could he? When James entered the cabin, stomping snow from his boots, Ruth was sitting at the table with both deeds spread before her. His eyes immediately went to the papers, and she saw his face pale with recognition. "Ruth," he began, but she held up her hand to stop him. "Is your name James Harrington?" she asked, her voice deadly quiet. James removed his hat slowly, running his fingers through his graying hair. "Yes." "And you own this property?" "According to that deed, yes. But Ruth, you have to understand." "I understand perfectly," Ruth said, standing abruptly. "I understand that I've been harboring a man who plans to evict me from my home. I understand that everything you've told me has been a lie." "That's not true," James said urgently, stepping toward her. "My name was the only lie, and I had reasons for that. Everything I've shared with you about Sarah, about my sons, about my regrets, all of that was true." Ruth's hand moved protectively to her belly. "Get out!" "Ruth, please, let me explain." "Explain what? How you planned to steal my home? How you've been manipulating me while I nursed you back to health? How you've been playing with my feelings while you planned to throw me out into the snow?" James's face contorted with pain. "I never planned any of this. I didn't even know you existed when I bought this land. The deed was just business, part of a larger transaction involving mineral rights and railroad access. I had no idea anyone was living here." "But you know now," Ruth said, tears threatening. "You've known for days that this is my home, and you said nothing." "Because I didn't know how to tell you without destroying what was growing between us," James admitted. "Because the more time I spent with you, the less any of it mattered: the land, the business, the money. All I cared about was the way you looked at me, the way you made me feel like the man I used to be." Ruth laughed bitterly. How convenient. The wealthy railroad baron falls for the poor widow just in time to ease his conscience about stealing her home. "It's not like that," James said desperately. "Ruth, I swear to you, I would give up that deed tomorrow if it meant keeping your trust. The land means nothing to me. You mean everything." "Easy words when you're not the one facing homelessness," Ruth replied. "Easy to be generous when you have an empire to fall back on." James stared at her, and she saw the exact moment when he realized the full scope of what he was losing. Not just her affection, but her respect, her trust, everything that had made these past days precious to him. "What can I do?" he asked quietly. "Tell me what I can do to make this right." Ruth looked at the two deeds again, her mind racing. The legal situation was complex, and she suspected that in any court battle, James Harrington's resources would far exceed her own. But more than that, she felt the foundation of everything she had believed about him crumbling beneath her feet. "You can leave," she said finally. "As soon as the storm passes, you can go back to your railroad empire and your grand plans, and you can leave me in peace." "Ruth, I saved your life," she said, her voice breaking. "I shared my food, my home, my stories. I let you finish Samuel's cradle, let you touch my child, let you see me hope for something I thought was gone forever. And all this time, you've been planning to take away the only thing I have left." James's face crumpled. "I wasn't planning anything. I didn't even remember owning this particular parcel until I saw that deed. My business manager handles dozens of transactions like this. I can't possibly keep track of every piece of land we acquire. So I'm just a casualty of your empire building," Ruth said. "An oversight in your grand design." "No," James said fiercely. "You're the most real thing that's happened to me in years. You're the only person who's seen me as just a man, not a title or a bank account. What we've shared here it's changed me, Ruth. It's shown me what I've been missing, what I've been running from." Ruth wanted to believe him. Despite everything, despite the evidence of his deception, part of her still saw the broken man who had wept for his lost family, who had carved her baby's cradle with such tender care. But trust, once broken, was not easily mended. "If that's true," she said carefully, "then prove it. Sign over the deed to me. Make this right." James was quiet for a long moment, and Ruth could see him struggling with something deeper than just property rights. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely audible. "I can't." "Why not?" "Because it's not that simple. That deed is tied to a larger project involving railroad access through this pass. If I sign it over to you, it could compromise months of planning and millions of dollars in investment, dozens of jobs, entire communities that depend on the railroad expansion." Ruth felt something cold settle in her chest. "So your business is more important than my home?" "It's not about importance," James said desperately. "It's about responsibility. I have obligations to investors, to employees, to communities that are counting on these projects." "And what about your obligation to me, to honesty, to basic human decency?" James ran his hands through his hair, looking suddenly older than his years. "You're right. You're absolutely right, and I have no excuse for not telling you sooner. But Ruth, there has to be another way. I could build you a house somewhere else, a proper house with everything you need. I could ensure you never want for anything." "You think this is about money?" Ruth asked, incredulous. "You think you can just buy your way out of this betrayal?" "I think I'm a man who's made mistakes, trying to figure out how to do right by someone who matters more to me than my own life," James replied, his voice raw with emotion. Ruth stared at him, seeing the pain in his eyes, the genuine anguish at having hurt her. But she also saw the fundamental divide between them, the gap between a man who thought in terms of deals and transactions and a woman who had nothing left but the small piece of ground she called home. "The storm is clearing," she said quietly, looking toward the window where pale sunlight was finally breaking through the clouds. "You should start preparing to leave." James stood frozen for a moment, as if he couldn't quite believe she was dismissing him. Then he nodded slowly, the movement heavy with defeat. "If that's what you want." "It's what has to be," Ruth replied, though the words felt like stones in her throat. As James began gathering his belongings, Ruth sat down heavily in her chair, her hand resting on her belly, where the baby stirred restlessly. She had thought herself beyond the reach of such heartbreak, had believed that losing Samuel was the worst pain she would ever endure. But this was different, not the clean grief of death, but the bitter ache of betrayal, of hope crushed by the weight of reality. Outside, she could hear James saddling the horse he had borrowed from her small stable, the old mare that had been Samuel's pride. Soon he would ride out of her life, back to his world of wealth and power, and she would be alone again with nothing but her memories and her steadily growing doubts about everything she had thought she knew about love, trust, and the possibility of second chances. The deed lay on the table before her, official and unforgiving, a reminder that in the end the world always came down to documents and laws and the cold reality of who owned what. Dreams and feelings were luxuries she could no longer afford. The afternoon passed in tense silence as James prepared for his departure. Ruth watched from the window as he checked and rechecked his gear, his movements careful and deliberate. The borrowed mare stood patiently in the clearing, her breath forming white clouds in the cold air. The storm had finally broken, leaving behind a world transformed by snow and ice. Ruth tried to focus on her mending, but her eyes kept drifting to the small leather locket that lay open on the table beside her sewing basket. Inside was a lock of fine brown hair, so soft it seemed to float at the slightest breath. It was all she had left of the baby she and Samuel had lost 3 years ago, their first child, who had lived only 6 days before fever claimed him. She had never shown the locket to anyone, not even Samuel in his final days. It was her private grief, her secret shrine to the child who might have been. But something about James's presence, his own obvious pain over lost family, had made her want to share this most intimate sorrow. Now she wondered if that impulse had been foolish, if she had revealed too much of herself to a man who was essentially a stranger. A wealthy stranger who owned her home and had lied about his identity from the moment he regained consciousness. Ruth. James's voice was soft, hesitant, as he stood in the doorway. "May I come in?" She nodded, without looking up from her work, not trusting her voice to remain steady. James entered slowly, his hat in his hands. His eyes immediately went to the open locket on the table, and she saw his expression soften with understanding. "I didn't mean to pry," he said quietly, "but I couldn't help but notice that from your first child." Ruth's hands stilled on her mending. "Yes." Samuel mentioned the baby. "No." Ruth's voice was barely a whisper. "Samuel was too heartbroken to speak of it. This little one lived 6 days. Long enough for us to name him, to love him, to imagine a future that would never be." James moved closer, his eyes never leaving the delicate locket. "What was his name?" "David, after Samuel's father." Ruth touched the locket gently. "He was so small, so perfect. The fever took him before we could even get him to a doctor." James sat down across from her, his own grief evident in his face. "I'm sorry, Ruth. That's a special kind of pain, losing a child." "You speak as if you know." James nodded slowly. "Sarah and I lost 2 babies between Michael and Thomas, both in the early months, but still the grief is real regardless of how long you get to hold them." Ruth looked up at him then, seeing the echo of her own loss in his eyes. "How do you bear it?" "The same way you do, I imagine. One day at a time, carrying the love with you even when the child is gone." James gestured toward her belly. "That's why this baby is so precious, why you're so afraid." Ruth's hand moved instinctively to the swell of her abdomen. "What if I lose this one too? What if I'm not meant to be a mother?" "Don't," James said firmly. "Don't torture yourself with those thoughts. This baby is strong. I can feel it every time it moves. And you're strong too, stronger than you know." "Am I?" "Because right now I feel like everything I touch turns to ashes. Samuel, our first baby. And now—" She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "And now me," James completed quietly. "Another loss, another disappointment." Ruth met his eyes, seeing the pain there. Despite her anger, despite the betrayal she felt, she couldn't deny the connection that had grown between them. In sharing their deepest griefs, they had created something precious and fragile, and now it lay broken between them like shattered glass. "I wanted to trust you," she whispered. "For the first time since Samuel died, I felt like I could open my heart again. You made me believe that maybe I deserved something more than just survival." James leaned forward, his voice urgent. "You do deserve more. You deserve everything good this world has to offer. Ruth, what I did was wrong, but what I feel for you, that's real. These feelings, this connection between us, That's not something that can be faked or manufactured. How can I know what's real anymore? Ruth asked, tears finally spilling over. You lied about your name, about who you are. How do I know you haven't been lying about everything else? James was quiet for a moment, then reached into his vest pocket and withdrew something small and worn. It was a daguerreotype in a silver frame, the image faded with age and handling. This is Sarah, he said, placing the photograph on the table beside Ruth's locket. And this is my son Michael, when he was about 5 years old. Ruth picked up the photograph, studying the faces within. Sarah Harrington had been a beautiful woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. The little boy beside her bore a strong resemblance to James, with the same piercing blue eyes and determined chin. They look happy, Ruth observed. They were, in that moment. This was taken just before I started the railroad expansion, before the business began consuming my life. Sarah used to carry this picture with her everywhere, said it reminded her of when we were still a family instead of just people who shared a house. Ruth understood. The photograph showed not just faces, but a moment in time when love was simpler, when success hadn't yet built walls between people who cared for each other. Why are you showing me this? She asked. Because I want you to understand who I was before I became James Harrington, railroad baron. I was a husband who loved his wife, a father who played with his children, a man who believed that family mattered more than anything else. James's voice broke slightly. Somewhere along the way I lost that man. But these past days with you, you've helped me remember who I used to be. Ruth set the photograph down carefully, her fingers lingering on the silver frame. That doesn't change what you've done. It doesn't make the lies acceptable. No, it doesn't, James agreed. But it might help you understand why I hesitated to tell you the truth. I wasn't trying to deceive you maliciously, Ruth. I was trying to hold on to the feeling of being seen as just a man, not as a collection of business interests and bank accounts. So you let me fall in love with someone who doesn't exist. The words hung in the air between them, stark and honest. Ruth hadn't meant to admit her feelings so plainly, but there they were, exposed and vulnerable. James's breath caught. You love me? Ruth looked away, embarrassed by her admission. I thought I did. I thought I was falling in love with James Cooper, the wounded drifter who needed my help. But James Harrington, the railroad magnate who owns my home, I don't know who that man is. He's the same person, James said softly. The wealth, the business empire. That's what I do, not who I am. The man who finished your baby's cradle, who held you when you cried about your fears for this child, who shared his deepest regrets and hopes that man is real, Ruth. That's who I am when all the rest is stripped away. Ruth wanted to believe him, every fiber of her being yearned to accept his words, to bridge the gap that had opened between them. But trust, once broken, was not easily mended. If that's true, she said carefully, then why can't you give up the deed? If you're really the man you claim to be, why choose your business empire over my home? James was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with exhaustion. Because I'm a coward, he admitted. Because giving up that deed means acknowledging that I've built my entire life on the wrong foundation, that everything I've worked for has been a mistake. It means admitting that Sarah was right, that my sons were right, that I chose money and power over love and family. Ruth felt a stab of sympathy despite her anger. She could see the war being fought in his eyes, the battle between the man he had become and the man he wanted to be. Maybe it's not too late to choose differently, she said quietly. Isn't it? I'm 53 years old, Ruth. My wife is dead. My sons won't speak to me. And I've spent 30 years building something that ultimately means nothing. How do you start over at my age? Ruth thought of her own losses, her own fresh starts. One choice at a time, one honest moment at a time, the same way anyone rebuilds their life after losing everything that mattered. James looked at her with something like awe. How do you do it? How do you keep hoping after everything you've lost? Ruth touched her locket again, then placed her hand over her growing belly. Because the alternative is giving up completely, and I have too much life left to live for that. This baby deserves a mother who believes in possibilities, who still thinks love is worth the risk, even after what I've done to you." Ruth considered the question seriously. "What you've done is break my trust and threaten my security. Those are serious things, James, and I'm not sure I can forgive them. But what you haven't done is destroy my capacity to love or hope. That's mine to give or withhold, and no one can take it from me." James stared at her, his expression a mixture of admiration and regret. "I don't deserve you, Ruth Langley. I never did." "Probably not," Ruth agreed with a sad smile. "But that was never the point, was it? Love isn't about deserving. It's about choosing to see the best in someone and hoping they'll do the same for you." They sat in silence as the afternoon light faded toward evening. Outside, the snow had stopped falling, and Ruth could see stars beginning to appear in the clearing sky. The storm was truly over, which meant James would leave in the morning, riding back to his world of wealth and responsibility. "What happens now?" James asked quietly. Ruth looked at the deed still lying on the table, then at the photograph of his lost family, then at the locket that held her own grief. "I don't know," she admitted. "I suppose we find out if love is strong enough to bridge the gap between who we are and who we want to be." James nodded, understanding that this was as close to hope as either of them could manage. The choices ahead would define not just their future together, but who they would choose to be when faced with the chance to do right by someone they loved. The baby stirred restlessly in Ruth's womb, and she wondered what kind of world this child would be born into, one where love conquered practical concerns, or one where duty and obligation always won in the end. Time would tell, but for now, it was enough to sit in the growing darkness with a man who had shown her both the heights of trust and the depths of betrayal, and to remember that even broken hearts could still beat with hope. Ruth woke before dawn to find James's bedroll empty. Panic seized her heart as she imagined him riding away in the darkness, fleeing from the confrontation that awaited them. But when she looked outside, she saw him standing beside the mare, not preparing to leave, but simply staring toward the eastern horizon, where the first pale light of morning was beginning to show. She wrapped Samuel's coat around her shoulders and stepped outside. The cold bit through her nightgown, but she needed to speak with him before he made his final decision about leaving. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked softly. James turned toward her, and she saw that his face was haggard, as if he had spent the night wrestling with demons. "Too much to think about," he replied. "James," Ruth began, but he held up his hand. "Before you say anything, there's something else you need to know. Something I should have told you yesterday, but I was too much of a coward." Ruth felt her stomach clench with dread. What other betrayal was coming? James reached into his coat and withdrew a folded letter, the paper expensive and crisp, despite having been carried in his pocket. "This came from my business partner 3 days before I left Denver. I found it again last night while packing." With trembling hands, Ruth took the letter. The letterhead read, "Harrington Railroad Company" in elaborate script, and the content made her blood run cold. "James, the Sangre de Cristo Pass acquisition is proceeding as planned. Walsh confirmed the Line Shack property will be vacated by month's end apparently. The current occupant is a pregnant widow with no legal representation. Should be a simple matter of enforcement once the weather clears. The survey team reports excellent potential for the northern route through the pass. We'll need to begin grading by spring if we're to meet the Denver connection deadline. Patterson is growing impatient about the delay. Suggest we expedite removal of any remaining squatters to avoid further complications. Regards, H. Morrison, Vice President, Operations." Ruth's hands shook as she read the letter a second time, the words seeming to burn themselves into her consciousness. "Squatters," she whispered. "He calls me a squatter. Ruth, you have to understand, Morrison doesn't know the situation. He's working from Walsh's information, and Walsh clearly misrepresented." "Did you know?" Ruth interrupted, her voice deadly quiet. "When you rode up here, did you know I was the pregnant widow your partner wanted removed?" James's silence was answer enough. "You did know," Ruth breathed. the full scope of his deception finally becoming clear. "You came here specifically to evict me. This was never about being lost in a storm or needing help. You came here to throw me out of my home." "That's no, it wasn't supposed to be like this," James said desperately. "Yes, I came to assess the property and determine the best way to handle the situation. But I never intended to hurt you, and I certainly never expected to fall in love with you." Ruth staggered backward as if he had struck her. "Love? You call this love? You've been lying to me from the moment you regained consciousness. Everything, your name, your reasons for being here, your feelings for me of it, has been part of some elaborate scheme to manipulate me into leaving quietly." "No," James stepped toward her, his face anguished. "My feelings for you are real, Ruth. Everything I've shared about Sarah, about my sons, about my regrets, that was all true. The only lies were about my name and my initial purpose in coming here." "Your initial purpose was to drive me from my home," Ruth said, her voice rising, "to make me and my unborn child homeless so you could build your precious railroad. How exactly does that translate into love?" James ran his hands through his hair, looking suddenly older than his years. "Because spending these days with you changed everything. Because seeing your strength, your faith, your capacity for mercy, even when you had every reason to turn me away, showed me what I've been missing, what I've been running from." Pretty words, James, but actions matter more than words, and your actions have been those of a man who sees me as an obstacle to be removed, not a woman to be loved. Ruth turned to go back inside, but James caught her arm gently. "Wait, please, just listen for a moment." Against her better judgment, Ruth stopped, though she didn't turn around. "You're right," James said quietly. "Everything you've said is true. I came here with the intention of convincing you to leave, one way or another. I told myself it was just business, that you were simply an inconvenience to be dealt with efficiently. And now I would burn down my entire empire before I'd let anyone harm you or your child. Now I understand what Sarah meant when she said I had lost sight of what really mattered. Now I know that everything I've built means nothing if I can't protect the woman I love." Ruth finally turned to face him, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Then prove it." "How?" "Give me the deed, right now, this moment. Sign it over to me and walk away from your railroad project. Choose me over your empire." James stared at her, and Ruth could see the war being fought behind his eyes. She was asking him to sacrifice everything he had worked for, everything that defined him in the world's eyes. But she was also asking him to choose love over money, mercy over business, the person he could be over the person he had become. For a moment, hope fluttered in her chest. She saw something shift in his expression, saw him reach toward his coat pocket where he kept his papers. Then his hand stopped, and his shoulders sagged with defeat. "I can't," he whispered. "God help me, Ruth. I want to, but I can't. There are too many people depending on this project, too many jobs and investments tied up in it. If I abandon it now, dozens of families will lose their livelihoods." Ruth felt something die inside her chest. So, in the end, it's not about love at all. It's about what's expedient, what's profitable, what serves the greater good, as defined by James Harrington. "It's about responsibility," James said desperately, "about obligations to people who trusted me with their money and their futures. What about your obligation to me? What about the trust I placed in you when I saved your life?" James had no answer for that, and his silence was more damning than any words could have been. Ruth walked back to the cabin, her steps heavy with exhaustion and heartbreak. Inside, she began gathering his belongings, packing them with the mechanical efficiency of a woman who had learned not to waste energy on futile gestures. "What are you doing?" James asked, following her inside. "Helping you pack. The sooner you leave, the sooner I can start preparing for what comes next." "Ruth, please, we can work something out. I meant what I said about building you a house somewhere else, ensuring you're provided for." "I don't want your charity," Ruth said without looking up from her work. "I don't want your money or your grand gestures or your guilty conscience." "Then what do you want?" Ruth paused in her packing, her hands resting on the sewing kit he had given her. Sarah's sewing kit, he had said, though she wondered now if even that had been a lie. "I want my home," she said simply. "I want to raise my child in the place where my husband lived and worked and loved me. I want to know that when I give my word, it means something, and when someone gives their word to me, it means something too." She placed the sewing kit carefully in his saddlebags, her fingers lingering on the soft leather for just a moment. But apparently that's too much to ask from James Harrington, railroad magnate. James watched her pack with an expression of such anguish that Ruth almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "How long do I have?" she asked without looking at him. "What?" "Before your men come to evict me. How long do I have to find somewhere else to go?" James was quiet for so long that Ruth finally looked up at him. His face had gone pale, and she could see that he was finally understanding the full implications of his choice. "Morrison mentioned month's end in his letter," James said slowly. "That gives you about 3 weeks. 3 weeks to find new shelter for myself and a baby who could be born any day," Ruth said, her voice matter of fact, despite the fear churning in her stomach. "Should be plenty of time." The sarcasm in her voice made James flinch. "Ruth, I swear to you, I'll make sure you're taken care of. I'll find you a proper place to live, somewhere safe and comfortable." "In exchange for what? My silence? My cooperation in your railroad project? My gratitude for your generosity?" "In exchange for nothing. Because it's the right thing to do. Because James stopped, the words dying in his throat. "Because you love me," Ruth finished for him. "Love doesn't look like this, James. Love doesn't calculate the cost and choose the profitable option. Love sacrifices, love protects, love puts the beloved's needs above its own comfort." Ruth picked up the finished cradle, Samuel's cradle that James had completed with such care and skill. For a moment, she held it against her chest, remembering the tenderness with which he had worked on it, the stories they had shared as he carved the final details. Then she set it down firmly and continued packing his things. "Take this with you," she said, nodding toward the cradle. "Ruth, no. That's for your baby. My baby will have to make do without luxuries. But perhaps someday, if you ever find the courage to reconcile with your sons, you can give it to one of your grandchildren. A reminder of the time you almost chose love over money." James stared at the cradle, his face crumpling with emotion. "I won't take it. Whatever else happens, that's yours. Your baby deserves to have something beautiful, something made with love." "Then leave it," Ruth said, her voice hollow. "Maybe whoever buys this property after you've destroyed it will have use for a baby's cradle." The words hit James like physical blows, and Ruth could see that she had finally made him understand the true cost of his choice. Not just the loss of their relationship, but the destruction of everything that had mattered to her, everything that had given her life meaning and stability. "Ruth," he whispered, "please don't end it like this. Don't let anger be the last thing between us." Ruth looked at him one final time, memorizing his face despite the pain it caused her. "Anger isn't what's ending this, James. Cowardice is. Your cowardice and my foolishness for believing that a man like you could ever choose a woman like me over everything the world says is important." She handed him his packed saddlebags and moved to open the cabin door. Cold morning air rushed in, carrying with it the promise of a clear day for traveling. "The storm's over," she said quietly. "Time for you to go home." James took the bags with hands that shook slightly, his eyes never leaving her face. "This isn't over, Ruth. I'll find a way to make this right." "No," Ruth replied, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to fall. "It is over, and deep down, you know that's for the best. Men like you don't belong in worlds like mine, and women like me are just temporary diversions for men like you." James opened his mouth to protest, but Ruth had already stepped back and begun closing the door. "Goodbye, James Harrington," she said softly. "I hope your railroad brings you everything you think you want." The door closed with a soft click, leaving James standing alone in the morning light with nothing but his regrets and the weight of what he had lost. Through the window, Ruth watched him load his belongings onto the mare, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he were carrying stones instead of saddlebags. He mounted the horse and sat for a long moment, looking back at the cabin where he had discovered what love could be, when it wasn't complicated by wealth and power. Then, without another word, he rode away down the mountain path, his figure growing smaller until the trees swallowed him completely. Ruth stood at the window until she could no longer hear the sound of hoofbeats, then sank into her chair and placed both hands over her growing belly. The baby kicked restlessly, as if sensing her distress, and she tried to summon the strength to comfort this child, who would soon enter a world made uncertain by her own choices. "It's just you and me now," she whispered to the life growing within her, just like it was always going to be. But even as she spoke the words, Ruth knew they weren't entirely true. For a brief, shining moment, she had allowed herself to believe in the possibility of something more, a partnership, a love that could weather any storm, a future that held more than mere survival. Now that possibility was gone, broken on the rocks of practical reality and the eternal divide between those who had everything and those who had nothing left to lose. James Harrington would return to his empire, and she would face whatever came next with the same stubborn faith that had carried her through every other loss. The morning sun streamed through the window, illuminating the empty space where James had slept, the chair where he had worked on the cradle, the corner where they had sat together and shared their deepest fears and dreams. In 3 weeks, other men would come to claim this place, and all evidence of what had transpired here would be erased as surely as snow melted in spring. But Ruth would remember. She would carry with her the memory of a man who had shown her that her heart was not as dead as she had believed, even if he had ultimately proven that some chasms were too wide to bridge. In the end, perhaps that knowledge was worth the price of loving and losing once more. The business letter lay forgotten on the table, its cold words a stark reminder that in the world of commerce and empire, individual hearts mattered very little. Ruth picked it up and fed it to the fire, watching the flames consume Morrison's dismissive references to squatters and complications. Let them come, she thought with grim determination. Let them try to remove her from the only home she had left. She had survived the loss of her husband, the death of her first child, and now the betrayal of the man she had foolishly allowed herself to love. She would survive this too, whatever form it took. The baby stirred again, and Ruth began to sing the same lullaby her mother had sung to her, the same words she had whispered to her first child during his brief 6 days of life. If this was to be their last weeks in the place Samuel had won for them, she would make them count. Outside, the mountain remained indifferent to human heartbreak, its peaks standing eternal against the morning sky. The storm had passed, leaving the world cleaner but not necessarily kinder. And somewhere down the winding trail, a man who had gained an empire but lost his soul rode toward a reckoning he was not yet ready to face. 3 days passed in solitude before Ruth heard the sound of approaching horses. She had been expecting James's men for weeks now, and as she looked out the window to see a group of riders emerging from the tree line, she felt a strange sense of relief that the waiting was finally over. But as the riders drew closer, Ruth realized with a start that the man in the lead was James himself. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she watched him dismount, followed by 2 other men in expensive coats who could only be business associates. Behind them rode a 4th man she didn't recognize, dressed in the practical clothes of a surveyor or engineer. Ruth's hand moved instinctively to the telegram that had arrived by special courier that morning, the first mail she had received since the storm. The message was brief and formal. Search party dispatched. Return immediately. Board meeting tomorrow requires your presence. Business cannot wait indefinitely. Morrison. So this was it then. James had returned not out of love or regret, but because his business partners had demanded it. The great James Harrington called back to his empire like a dog to heel. Ruth straightened her shoulders and opened the door before they could knock. She would meet this final confrontation with dignity, whatever the cost. "Mr. Harrington," she said formally, her voice steady despite the chaos in her heart. I wasn't expecting you to return so soon. James removed his hat, his blue eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her look away. Mrs. Langley, I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but there are some matters we need to discuss. I imagine there are. Ruth's gaze moved to the other men, noting their expensive clothes and the way they studied her cabin with obvious distaste. Would you care to introduce your companions? Of course. This is Harrison Morrison, my business partner. James indicated a thin man with calculating eyes. Theodore Walsh, our legal counsel. The second man was older, with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to getting his way. And this is Robert Caldwell, our chief surveyor. Morrison stepped forward, his manner brisk and businesslike. Mrs. Langley, I trust you received our telegram regarding the change in property ownership? I did. Ruth's voice was cool. Though I must say, your communication was rather lacking in detail. Walsh cleared his throat, producing a leather portfolio from his coat. Perhaps we could discuss this matter inside. There are several documents that require your attention. Ruth hesitated, unwilling to invite these men into the space where she and James had shared such intimate moments. But the cold mountain air was harsh, and her pregnancy made standing for long periods uncomfortable. Very well, she said, stepping aside to allow them entry. The four men filled her small cabin completely, their presence making the space feel cramped and foreign. Morrison and Walsh immediately began examining the rough furnishings with obvious disdain, while Caldwell pulled out a notebook and began sketching the room's dimensions. James stood apart from the others, his attention focused entirely on Ruth. She could see the strain in his face, the shadows under his eyes that suggested he had slept little since leaving her 3 days ago. Perhaps you could explain exactly why you've come, Ruth said, settling into her chair with as much dignity as she could manage. Morrison took charge, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to controlling every conversation. Mrs. Langley, as you know, this property now belongs to the Harrington Railroad Company. We're prepared to offer you generous compensation for vacating the premises, along with assistance in relocating to more suitable accommodations. And if I refuse? Walsh opened his portfolio and withdrew several official-looking documents. I'm afraid refusal is not an option. We have a valid deed to this property, properly filed with the territorial government. Your continued occupancy constitutes trespassing. Ruth looked at the papers he held, recognizing the same deed James had carried. I have my own deed to this property, properly won and legally transferred. From Garrett Walsh, yes, the lawyer replied smoothly. Unfortunately, Mr. Walsh did not have clear title to the property when he transferred it to your late husband. His debt to our client predated that transaction, making your deed invalid. Ruth felt the room spin slightly. That's impossible. Samuel verified the ownership before the poker game. He was careful about such things. I'm sure he was. Morrison interjected, his tone condescending. But paperwork can be confusing for those not familiar with territorial law. The important thing now is to resolve this matter amicably. Amicably, Ruth repeated the word as if it tasted bitter. You mean quietly, without legal challenge or public scrutiny? James finally spoke, his voice rough with emotion. Ruth, they're offering fair compensation, enough for you to buy a proper house in town with medical care available for the baby. Ruth looked at him sharply, hearing something in his tone that the others missed. Was he trying to tell her something or simply easing his conscience by ensuring she was provided for? Caldwell looked up from his sketching. Ma'am, I have to say this location is poorly suited for habitation, especially with a child coming. The isolation, the harsh weather, the lack of medical facilities, it's really not safe. My husband and I managed quite well, Ruth replied stiffly. Your husband wasn't 7 months pregnant, Morrison pointed out. What will you do when your time comes? Who will assist with the birth? Ruth had been trying not to think about that very question. Samuel's death had cost her not just a husband, but the partner who would have been her primary support during childbirth. She had been hoping to make it to the town of San Luis before the baby came, but travel was becoming increasingly difficult as her pregnancy advanced. "I'll manage," she said firmly, though doubt gnawed at her. Walsh leaned forward, his manner becoming more aggressive. "Mrs. Langley, let me be frank. We have legal right to this property, and we will exercise that right with or without your cooperation. You can accept our generous offer and leave with dignity, or you can force us to involve the territorial marshal. Either way, you will be leaving." Ruth felt anger flare in her chest. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Walsh?" "I'm stating facts," the lawyer replied coolly, "though I would hope a woman in your condition would choose the reasonable course." James suddenly stood, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "That's enough, Walsh. There's no need for threats." Morrison looked at his partner with surprise. "James, we agreed." "We agreed to resolve this matter," James interrupted, his voice carrying an authority that made the other men fall silent. "Not to bully a pregnant woman." Ruth watched this exchange with growing confusion. James's behavior didn't match what she would have expected from a man who had chosen his business over her welfare. There was a tension in his stance, a barely controlled anger that seemed directed at his own associates rather than at her. "Perhaps," James continued, "we could give Mrs. Langley some time to consider our offer. This is a significant decision, and she shouldn't be pressured into anything hasty." "Time is exactly what we don't have," Morrison protested. "The board is breathing down our necks about the delays, and Patterson is threatening to pull his investment if we don't start construction by spring." "The board can wait another day or two," James said firmly. Walsh gathered his papers with obvious frustration. "James, I have to advise against this course of action. Every day we delay increases our legal exposure and gives her more opportunity to complicate matters." "Complicate matters how?" Ruth asked. "By seeking legal counsel of your own," Walsh replied bluntly. "By making public claims about the validity of your deed, by forcing us into a protracted court battle that could delay the entire project." Ruth felt a spark of hope. "You're afraid of a court challenge." "We're not afraid of anything," Morrison said quickly, but Ruth caught the glance he exchanged with Walsh. "Then why the rush? Why not let me have my day in court if you're so confident in your legal position?" The silence that followed was telling. Ruth looked from one man to another, seeing doubt in their expressions, despite their confident words. "The truth is," James said quietly, "there are some irregularities in the paperwork that could make a court challenge problematic. Nothing that would ultimately change the outcome, but enough to cause delays we can't afford." Morrison shot him a warning look, but James continued. "You have more leverage than they want you to know, Ruth. Your deed may not be perfect, but it's not worthless either." "James," Walsh said sharply, "I must advise you not to tell the truth?" James turned to face his associate, and Ruth saw something dangerous flicker in his eyes. "Mrs. Langley has the right to understand her options." Ruth felt her pulse quicken. James was undermining his own business partners, giving her information that could help her fight their claim. Why? Caldwell, who had been quietly continuing his sketches, suddenly looked up. "Mr. Harrington, there's something else you should know. The survey I conducted last week revealed some potential complications with the northern route through the pass." "What kind of complications?" Morrison demanded. "Geological instability. The grade we would need for the railroad cuts through an area prone to rock slides. It's not impossible to work around, but it would require significant additional engineering and expense." Morrison's face darkened. "You're just mentioning this now." "I wanted to complete my full analysis before making any recommendations," Caldwell replied. "But the truth is, there might be better routes that would make this particular property less critical to the project." Ruth saw Morrison and Walsh exchange another look, this one heavy with implications. If the property was less critical, their legal position became correspondingly weaker. "How much less critical?" James asked, and Ruth heard something like hope in his voice. "Well," Caldwell said slowly, "if we were willing to extend the route by approximately 5 miles to the south, we could avoid both the geological issues and the need for this particular parcel." 5 miles represents significant additional cost, Morrison protested. Less than the cost of a protracted legal battle and the engineering solutions needed for the northern route, Caldwell replied. Ruth felt her heart racing. Was it possible? Could there be a solution that would allow her to keep her home while still giving James his railroad? James was studying Caldwell's sketches with intense concentration. "Show me the alternative route." As Caldwell spread out his maps on Ruth's small table, she found herself drawn into the discussion, despite her earlier resolve to simply endure whatever they decided. The surveyor's alternative route was indeed longer, but it followed more stable ground and avoided several other potential complications beyond just her property. The additional construction cost would be substantial, Morrison said, studying the maps with obvious reluctance. But the long-term maintenance costs would be lower, Caldwell pointed out, and we wouldn't face the legal uncertainties associated with this property. Ruth watched James's face as he considered the options. She could see him weighing costs and benefits, but also something else, something that looked very much like relief. "What's the timeline on the alternative route?" he asked. "We could have construction started by late spring, assuming we begin surveying immediately," Caldwell replied. Morrison shook his head. "The board will never approve the additional expense without compelling justification." "Then I'll provide that justification," James said firmly. "The geological surveys alone should be enough to convince them that the southern route is the more prudent choice." Walsh closed his portfolio with a snap. "James, I strongly advise against abandoning our legal position here. We have a valid claim to this property. A claim that's going to cost us months in court and potentially millions in engineering solutions," James replied. "Sometimes the smart business decision is knowing when to walk away." Ruth stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. Was James actually choosing to abandon his claim to her property? Was he finding a way to choose her over his business after all? But even as hope bloomed in her chest, she forced herself to remain cautious. This could still be an elaborate manipulation, a way to ensure her cooperation while achieving the same end result. "And what about me?" she asked quietly. "What happens to me in this new plan?" James met her eyes directly, and Ruth saw something there that made her breath catch. "You stay here, in your home, for as long as you want. The railroad goes around your property, and you live your life in peace." "James," Morrison said warningly, "the board is not going to accept." "The board will accept what I tell them to accept," James interrupted, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. "I built this company, and I'll run it as I see fit." Ruth felt tears prick her eyes, but she wasn't ready to trust this apparent victory. "And what's to stop you from changing your mind again? What's to stop your business partners from finding another way to pressure me off this land?" James was quiet for a moment, then reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document. "This." He handed her the paper, and Ruth's hands trembled as she recognized her own deed, but now it bore James's signature as well, formally renouncing any claim to the property and confirming her full legal ownership. "When did you?" Ruth began. "This morning, before we rode up here," James said quietly. "I had Walsh prepare the paperwork, though he didn't know what I intended to do with it." Walsh looked thunderstruck. "James, you can't be serious. You're walking away from $1 million project to do the right thing," James finished. "For once in my life, to actually do the right thing." Morrison stood abruptly, his face flushed with anger. "This is insanity. You're jeopardizing the entire company for the sake of one woman who means nothing to our business interests." "She means everything to my personal interests," James replied, his voice steady and sure. "And for the first time in 30 years, I'm choosing to put those first." Ruth stared at the deed in her hands, at James's bold signature beside her own. This wasn't a business decision or a calculated gesture. It was a choice, pure and simple, a choice to honor love over profit, mercy over expedience. "Why?" she whispered. James smiled sadly. "Because you were right. Because love doesn't calculate the cost and choose the profitable option." Because I've finally understood that everything I've built means nothing if I can't protect the woman I love." The words hung in the air like a promise, transforming everything Ruth thought she knew about James Harrington and the man he was capable of being. Morrison's face had gone from flushed to pale, and Ruth could see the exact moment when the full implications of James's decision hit him. "Do you understand what you're doing?" he asked, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "This isn't just about one property, James. The board has invested everything in this northern route. Patterson, Crawford, the Denver consortium there, all expecting returns based on our projections." James stood slowly, his eyes never leaving Ruth's face. "Then we'll have to disappoint them." "You'll have to disappoint them," Walsh corrected sharply, "because I refuse to be party to this madness." He began gathering his papers with sharp, angry movements. "This company has legal obligations, fiduciary responsibilities to its investors. You can't simply abandon a $1 million project because you've developed romantic feelings for a—" "Choose your next words very carefully," James interrupted, his voice carrying a dangerous edge that made both Morrison and Walsh step back. Ruth watched this confrontation with a mixture of amazement and growing understanding. This wasn't just about her property anymore. It was about who James Harrington really was beneath the wealth and power, about what kind of man he would choose to be when everything was at stake. Caldwell, who had been quietly rolling up his maps, cleared his throat. "If I may interject, gentlemen, from an engineering standpoint, the southern route really is the superior choice. Yes, it's more expensive initially, but the long-term benefits—" "No one asked for your opinion, Caldwell," Morrison snapped. "Your job is to survey, not to make business decisions." "Actually," James said quietly, "his job is to give me accurate information so I can make informed decisions. And based on that information, I'm choosing the southern route." Morrison pulled out a telegram from his pocket, his hands shaking with anger. "This came this morning from the board. They're calling an emergency meeting for tomorrow. They want answers about the delays, about the cost overruns, about why the great James Harrington has disappeared into the mountains when his empire is falling apart." Ruth felt her stomach clench. "Your empire is falling apart?" James glanced at her, then back at Morrison. "There have been some complications with other projects. Nothing that can't be managed, but it's made the board nervous." "Nervous?" Morrison laughed bitterly. "James, they're talking about removing you as president. There are votes being counted, alliances being formed. If you don't return immediately and demonstrate that you're still in control of this situation, you'll lose everything." Ruth saw something flicker across James's face, not fear, exactly, but a deep weariness that spoke of battles fought and refought over decades. "Maybe it's time I did lose everything," he said quietly. "What?" Morrison stared at him as if he'd announced his intention to set himself on fire. "Maybe it's time I stopped trying to hold on to an empire that's cost me everything that actually mattered," James continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "My wife died thinking I loved money more than her. My sons won't speak to me because I chose business meetings over their baseball games, profit margins over family dinners. I've spent 30 years building something that's brought me nothing but loneliness and regret." Walsh stepped forward, his legal mind clearly struggling to comprehend this abandonment of everything they had worked toward. "James, you're not thinking clearly. This woman, Mrs. Langley, she's obviously had some sort of influence on you, but you can't throw away decades of work for love," James finished. "For the chance to be the man my wife always hoped I could be, for the possibility of building something that actually matters instead of just something that's profitable." Ruth felt tears threaten as she listened to this powerful, wealthy man risk everything he had built for the simple chance to choose love over money. But she also heard the pain in his voice, the decades of regret that had brought him to this moment. "James," she said softly, "you don't have to do this. Not for me." He turned to her, his blue eyes intense and sure. "Yes, I do. Not just for you, but for me, for the man I want to be instead of the man I've become." Morrison played his final card, pulling out an official-looking document sealed with red wax. This is a notice of no confidence from the board. If you're not in Denver by tomorrow morning, prepared to address their concerns, they'll vote to remove you as president. Everything you've built, everything you've worked for, gone. James took the document and read it carefully, his expression growing more serene with each paragraph. When he finished, he looked up at Morrison with something that might have been gratitude. "Thank you," he said simply. "Thank you?" Morrison looked as if James had slapped him. "Did you hear what I just said? They're going to destroy you." "No," James replied, moving to stand beside Ruth's chair. "They're going to free me. From obligations I never wanted, from responsibilities that have poisoned everything good in my life, from the prison I built around myself with money and power." He placed his hand gently on Ruth's shoulder, and she could feel the warmth of his touch through the fabric of her dress. "The only thing that matters to me now is right here in this room. The woman I love, the child she's carrying, the chance to build something real instead of just something impressive." Walsh made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "What about your sons, your legacy, everything you wanted to leave to them?" James was quiet for a moment, and Ruth could see him struggling with this final consideration. She knew how much his estrangement from his children tormented him, how deeply he regretted the choices that had driven them apart. "Maybe," he said slowly, "the best legacy I can leave them is the example of a father who finally learned to choose love over ambition. Maybe if they see me make this choice, they'll understand that I've finally learned what Sarah tried to teach me all those years ago." Morrison threw up his hands in defeat. "You're insane, completely insane. When this all falls apart, when you're left with nothing but a cabin in the mountains and a woman who can't give you the life you're accustomed to, don't come crying to us." "I won't," James replied with quiet certainty, "because a cabin in the mountains with the woman I love is worth more than an empire built on the wrong foundation." Ruth felt her heart soar at his words, but practical concerns intruded on her joy. "James, are you sure? Really sure? Because once you walk away from all of this, there might not be a way back." James knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "Ruth, I've spent the last 3 days thinking about nothing else. I've weighed every option, considered every consequence. And the only thing I know for certain is that I can't live with myself if I choose money over love again." He looked into her eyes with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I love you. Not the widow I can help, not the woman I can provide for, but you, Ruth Langley, who saved my life and showed me what my heart was capable of. I want to spend whatever time I have left, earning your trust, building a life with you, being the kind of man who deserves your love." Ruth searched his face, looking for any sign of doubt or uncertainty. What she saw instead was a peace she had never seen in him before, a calm certainty that spoke of a man who had finally found his true north. "What about your sons?" she asked softly. "I'll write to them," James replied. "I'll tell them about you, about the choice I've made, about the lessons you've taught me. Maybe they'll understand. Maybe they'll even want to meet the woman who helped their father remember what really matters." Morrison gathered his papers with sharp, angry movements. "This is a mistake of historic proportions, James. You're going to regret this for the rest of your life." "The only thing I regret," James replied, standing to face his former business partner, "is that it took me 53 years to learn the difference between success and happiness." As Morrison and Walsh prepared to leave, their faces masks of frustration and disbelief, Ruth felt a strange mixture of elation and terror. James had chosen her, had literally given up an empire for love. But what if she wasn't worth such a sacrifice? What if the reality of life without wealth and power proved too difficult for him to bear? The seal of the railroad company lay on her table, its gold embossing catching the afternoon light. It represented everything James was walking away from, everything he was choosing to leave behind for the uncertain promise of love in a mountain cabin. Ruth looked at that seal, and then at the man who was willing to abandon it, and felt her heart make its own choice. Whatever came next, they would face it together. After Morrison, Walsh, and Caldwell had departed, their horses' hoofbeats fading into the mountain silence, Ruth and James found themselves alone with the magnitude of what had just transpired. The cabin felt impossibly quiet after the confrontation, filled with the weight of choices made and bridges burned. Ruth sat in her chair, the deed with James's signature still trembling in her hands, while James stood by the window watching his former associates disappear down the mountain trail. The afternoon light slanted through the glass, casting long shadows across the floor where the railroad company's seal still lay forgotten. "Are you afraid?" Ruth asked quietly. James turned from the window, and she saw in his face a calmness she had never seen before. "Terrified," he admitted with a small smile. "But not of losing the money or the power. I'm afraid I'm not worthy of the choice I just made. Afraid I don't know how to be the man you deserve." Ruth set the deed carefully on the table and rose from her chair, her movements careful due to her advanced pregnancy. She walked to where James stood and reached into her dress pocket, withdrawing a simple silver ring, not her wedding band, but a delicate piece that had belonged to her mother. "This was my mother's," she said, holding the ring out to him. "She gave it to me on her deathbed, told me to save it for when I found a love worth the risk of hoping again." James stared at the ring, understanding the significance of what she was offering. "Ruth, I don't know what our future holds," Ruth continued, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "I don't know if you'll be happy living simply, or if I'll be able to make you forget what you've given up. But I know that what we have is real, and I know that I want to try." James took the ring with reverent care, his fingers tracing the delicate silver band. "Are you asking me to marry you, Ruth Langley? I'm asking if you're willing to build something together that's based on love instead of convenience, trust instead of contract, hope instead of fear." James looked at the ring, then at her face, then back at the ring. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "I've never wanted anything more in my life." He took her left hand gently, noting how her wedding ring caught the light. "What about Samuel?" Ruth looked down at her husband's ring, feeling the familiar weight of grief and love intertwined. "Samuel will always be part of who I am. His love taught me that I was worthy of devotion. His death taught me how precious time is. I can't promise to love you the same way I loved him, but I can promise to love you completely, with everything I've learned about what love costs and what it's worth." "I wouldn't want you to forget him," James said softly. "He made you who you are, and who you are is the woman I fell in love with." Ruth smiled through the tears that were now flowing freely. "Then ask me properly. James Harrington. Not as a railroad baron making a business arrangement, but as a man asking a woman to share her life with him." James dropped to one knee beside her chair, still holding her mother's ring. "Ruth Elizabeth Langley, will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my days proving that I'm worthy of your love? Will you help me become the man I was meant to be before I lost my way?" "Yes," Ruth whispered, then louder. "Yes, I will." James slipped the silver ring onto her right hand, where it nestled beside Samuel's gold bandpast, and future, grief and hope, existing together in the complex reality of a heart large enough to hold both. As he stood and took her in his arms, Ruth felt the baby kick vigorously, as if celebrating this moment of commitment and new beginning. James felt the movement too, and placed his hand over her belly, his face lighting up with wonder. "This child will be ours," he said quietly. "Not just yours, but ours. I want to be there for the birth, for the first steps, for every moment. I want to be the father I never was to my own sons. And if they accept you back into their lives, if your choice to walk away from the business opens a door to reconciliation." James considered this, his hand still resting on her belly where their future moved restlessly. "Then this child will have older brothers who can teach him about forgiveness and second chances. And I'll have the chance to prove to all my children that I've finally learned what matters most." They stood together in the afternoon light, holding each other and the promise of the life they would build together. Outside, the mountains stretched eternal and indifferent, but inside the small cabin, Two people who had thought themselves beyond such gifts had found their way to hope. "What will we live on?" Ruth asked practically. "I have almost nothing saved. And you?" "I have some investments separate from the railroad company," James replied. "Enough for us to live simply but comfortably. We won't have luxury, but we'll have what we need." Ruth smiled. "I've lived simply before. It's luxury I'm not sure I'd know what to do with." "Good," James said, kissing her forehead, "because the only luxury I want is time with you and our child." As evening approached, they began to plan their future together. James would need to return to Denver briefly to settle his affairs and arrange for someone else to take over his business interests. Ruth would prepare for the baby's birth and for the wedding they would have once James returned. "How long?" Ruth asked, as they discussed the practical details. 2 weeks, maybe 3 at most," James replied. "Just long enough to sign the papers and make arrangements. I won't be gone longer than necessary, not with the baby due so soon." Ruth nodded, though the thought of being alone again, even briefly, filled her with anxiety. "Promise me you won't change your mind. Promise me that when you get back to that world of wealth and power, you won't decide this was all a mistake." James cupped her face in his hands, his blue eyes serious and intent. "Ruth, I give you my word. The only mistake would be going back to a life that meant nothing. You are my home now. This cabin, this mountain, this life we're planning together, this is the only world I want." They sealed the promise with a kiss that tasted of hope and new beginnings, of love chosen over obligation and trust, rebuilt from the ashes of betrayal. The baby kicked between them, a reminder of the future they were creating together, a future built on the foundation of what they had learned about love's true cost and value. As night fell over the mountains, James and Ruth sat together planning their wedding, their life, their shared dreams. The railroad company's seal still lay forgotten on the table, but neither of them looked at it anymore. Their eyes were focused on the future they would build together, simple, honest, and rooted in the kind of love that could weather any storm. Outside, the wind whispered through the pine trees, carrying with it the promise of spring and new beginnings. Inside the small cabin, two hearts that had known loss and loneliness had found their way to each other, proving that even in the harshest seasons, love could bloom in the most unexpected places. James held Ruth close as she drifted toward sleep, his hand resting protectively over their unborn child. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as he prepared to return to Denver and face the consequences of his choice. But tonight, for this precious moment, they had everything they needed: each other, the promise of new life, and the courage to choose love over everything the world said was more important. The silver ring caught the firelight, a tangible symbol of their commitment to build something lasting together. Ruth's mother's ring, given in love and hope for a future worth believing in. It represented everything they were choosing: the leap of faith that love required, the willingness to trust despite past pain, the belief that some things were worth more than money or power or the approval of the world. As Ruth fell asleep in his arms, James whispered a prayer of gratitude for the storm that had brought him to her door, for the mercy that had saved his life, and for the courage to finally choose the right path, even when it meant walking away from everything he had spent a lifetime building. In losing his empire, he had found his soul. In choosing love, he had finally come home. 6 months later, Ruth Harrington stood in the doorway of their expanded cabin, watching her husband teach their 3-month-old son to grip his finger. The baby named Samuel James Harrington, in honor of both the father who had given Ruth her first taste of love and the father who had chosen love over empire, gazed up at James with the serious blue eyes he had inherited from his papa. The cabin itself had grown over the summer months. James had built a proper bedroom, a larger kitchen, and a workshop where he crafted furniture that was both beautiful and practical. The cradle that had brought them together now sat in the corner of the nursery, holding the child who had been born into a world of certainty and love. Ruth watched James with their son and marveled at the transformation in the man she had married. The tension that had once lined his face was gone, replaced by a contentment that seemed to radiate from within. His hands, once soft from years of signing papers and counting money, were now calloused from honest work-building, creating, nurturing the life they had chosen together. "A letter came today," Ruth said, settling into the rocking chair James had made for her during the final weeks of her pregnancy. "From Michael." James looked up, hope and apprehension warring in his expression. The reconciliation with his sons had been slow and tentative, beginning with the letter James had written from Denver, explaining his choice to walk away from the railroad empire. Michael, the eldest, had been the first to respond, his initial letter full of anger and confusion. But gradually, through patient correspondence, understanding had begun to grow. "What does he say?" James asked, gently shifting baby Samuel to his shoulder. Ruth unfolded the letter, her voice warm as she read. "He says he and Thomas are planning to visit next month. They want to meet me properly and to see their new brother." She looked up at James with tears in her eyes. "He says he's proud of you for finally choosing family over business, and that their mother would have been proud too." James closed his eyes, and Ruth could see the emotion overwhelming him. The forgiveness he had thought lost forever was slowly being restored, one letter at a time, one small gesture of understanding building upon another. "There's more," Ruth continued. "He's thinking of leaving his law practice in San Francisco, maybe coming to Colorado to start fresh. He says watching you choose love over money has made him reconsider his own priorities." James opened his eyes, wonder written across his features. "He wants to come home." "He wants to come home," Ruth confirmed. "Not to the mansion in Denver, but here, to this new life you've built, this family you've chosen." The transformation in James's face was remarkable, years of regret and loneliness, lifting like morning fog burned away by sunshine. He had feared that walking away from his empire meant losing his sons forever, but instead it had shown them a path back to each other. Baby Samuel chose that moment to gurgle contentedly, his tiny fist gripping James's shirt with surprising strength. James laughed, the sound rich and free in a way Ruth had never heard before their marriage. "Your brother's coming to visit," James told the baby solemnly, "and your Uncle Thomas too. They're going to teach you how to be trouble, I'm sure." Ruth smiled at the picture they made, father and son bonding over the simple miracle of being together. The baby who had been born into uncertainty had instead entered a world made stable by love, surrounded by parents who had learned the true value of family through loss and redemption. The new cradle James had commissioned sat nearby, beautifully carved from mountain pine and inlaid with delicate patterns that told the story of their love. It was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, but more than that, it was a symbol of hope, fulfilled the promise of new life, nurtured by parents who understood what it meant to choose love over fear. "Do you ever regret it?" Ruth asked quietly, the question that sometimes surfaced in her most vulnerable moments. "Giving up everything you worked for?" James considered the question seriously, as he always did when she asked. Then he looked around their cabinet, the furniture he had built with his own hands, at the garden Ruth had planted that now provided much of their food, at the life they had created from scratch, and shook his head. "The only thing I regret is waiting so long to do it," he said firmly. "Ruth, I spent 30 years building something that crumbled the moment I walked away. But this," he gestured around their humble home, "this we built to last. This has a foundation that won't crack under pressure or blow away in the first storm." Ruth nodded, understanding. The railroad empire had been built on shifting sands of profit and ambition, but their marriage was built on the bedrock of mutual respect, shared values, and love tested by adversity. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts, and Ruth smiled as she recognized the caller. Dr. Sarah Martinez had become a regular visitor since Samuel's birth, not just as their physician but as a friend. The young doctor, one of the few women practicing medicine in the territory, had been impressed by the couple's dedication to their simple life and their obvious devotion to each other. "How are my favorite patients today?" Dr. Martinez asked as she entered, her medical bag in one hand and a small gift wrapped in brown paper in the other. "Growing stronger every day," James replied, proudly displaying their son. Samuel's already trying to roll over, and Ruth is recovering beautifully from the birth. Dr. Martinez examined the baby with practiced efficiency, pronouncing him healthy and thriving. Then she handed Ruth the wrapped package with a knowing smile. "From the Women's Auxiliary in San Luis," she explained. "They wanted to welcome the new baby properly." Ruth unwrapped the gift to find a beautifully knitted blanket in soft blue wool, along with a note signed by a dozen women she had never met. The kindness of strangers touched her deeply, a reminder that community and connection could be found in the most unexpected places. "They're planning a church social next month," Dr. Martinez continued. "They specifically asked if you and James would attend. It seems your story has become quite the inspiration to the local couples." Ruth looked at James questioningly. They had kept to themselves mostly, focusing on building their life together and preparing for the baby. But perhaps it was time to expand their circle, to become part of the larger community that surrounded their mountain home. "What do you think?" she asked her husband. James smiled, bouncing Samuel gently. "I think our son should grow up knowing he's part of something larger than just our family, and I think his parents could use some practice being social again." As Dr. Martinez prepared to leave, she paused at the door. "You know, I've delivered a lot of babies to a lot of families, but I've never seen a home quite like this one. There's something special here, something that goes beyond just love between husband and wife." "What do you mean?" Ruth asked. "Peace," the doctor replied simply. "Real peace, the kind that comes from people who know exactly who they are and what they value. Your son is lucky to be born into that." After Dr. Martinez left, Ruth and James spent the evening on their front porch, watching the sun set over the mountains that had brought them together. Samuel slept peacefully in his father's arms, while Ruth worked on a new dress sewing had become both necessity and pleasure in their simple life. "I got another letter today too," James said quietly, "from Morrison." Ruth looked up from her stitching. James's former business partner had written several times over the months, initially with anger and accusations, then gradually with a grudging respect for James's choice. "The railroad company went through with the southern route," James continued. "Caldwell was right. It's been much more successful than the northern route would have been. Morrison wanted me to know that my foolish decision actually saved them millions in engineering costs." Ruth smiled. "Are you tempted to say, 'I told you so'?" "Not really. I'm just grateful it worked out for everyone. The investors are happy, the railroad is profitable, and we get to keep our home. Sometimes the right choice benefits more people than just the ones making it." As full darkness settled over the mountains, they moved inside to prepare for bed. James carefully placed Samuel in his cradle, both parents marveling at how peaceful their son looked in sleep. The future stretched ahead of them, not without challenges, but filled with possibilities they could face together. Ruth hung her mother's ring on a peg beside the bed, next to Samuel's gold wedding band, which he still wore on special occasions. Past and present, loss and hope, all had their place in the rich tapestry of their life together. "Tomorrow I start work on the addition for when Michael visits," James said as they settled into bed. "I want him to have his own space, somewhere he can feel at home." "Our home keeps growing," Ruth observed contentedly. "Our family keeps growing," James corrected. "The home just has to keep up." As they drifted towards sleep, Ruth reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. A storm, a wounded stranger, an act of mercy that had changed two lives forever. She thought of Samuel Langley, whose love had taught her she was worthy of devotion, and of James Harrington, whose choice had taught her that love was indeed worth any risk. Their son slept peacefully in the cradle that symbolized their beginning, surrounded by furniture his father had built and blankets made by the kindness of strangers. He would grow up knowing that love was more valuable than money, that family mattered more than fame, that sometimes the most important victories were the quiet ones that happened in small cabins on remote mountains. Outside, the wind whispered through the pine trees, carrying with it the promise of all the seasons to come. Inside, three hearts beat in rhythm with the peace that comes from choices made in love, lives built on trust, and the courage to believe that some storms are worth weathering for the clear skies that follow. The railroad had gone around their property as promised, but it had left behind something far more valuable than any iron rails or financial empire rate, had left behind proof that love, once chosen with a whole heart, could indeed conquer all.